Hey everyone, I just wanted to make a few brief comments about the Unit 4 discussion and about Unit 4 a bit more broadly. As usual, you all did a very good job of discussing a wide range of different issues. Of course, the unifying theme for this unit was nationalism in Latin America. We saw the case of the Mexican Revolution as the first social revolution of the 20th century, with at least as one of its goals to make a space to have Mexico for the Mexican people rather than for outside interests and for the heavy-handed government that was put in place by Porfirio Diaz. Also as an option, as our authors pointed out, rather than revolution, was the pathway of reform, and that was something that we saw especially in Argentina and in Uruguay with Batllismo. Those examples were where reformers were able to gain election into the existing system. Many of those people were like the Francisco Maderos in Mexico. They came from a middle class that had been long kind of pushed out of participation in the political system. But in the case of the Southern Cone, people like Batlle and Irigoyen in Uruguay and Argentina, respectively, were able to carve out a place for themselves within the existing system, meaning that they were able to effect change from within. In Mexico, however, the system was such that, as Wood points out, the entire house had to be brought down in order to rebuild it. And that was what happened with the Mexican Revolution. And as we saw, it was a very intense, bloody, and chaotic decade of fighting that resulted in one of the most progressive constitutions that Latin America had seen, and that the Western Hemisphere had seen, for that matter. The Constitution of 1917 turned control of resources over to the Mexican people, the Mexican nation. And again, the idea, by and large, was to create a system economically and politically and socially that would benefit the Mexican people. As was pointed out, however, figures like Álvaro Obregón and then Plutarco Elias Calles were able to institutionalize the revolution in such a way that political cronyism, party power, began to kind of return and displace the popular nature of the Mexican Revolution. So the leaders like Villa and Zapata, for example, were of the people. They weren't part of the old established order. They weren't even from the middle class, as Madero had been. And they represented the interests of most Mexicans in very different ways. Those who essentially won the revolution, like Obregón and Calles, wanted to institutionalize and create a new government, which makes a lot of sense. That was part of their role as elected officials in Mexico City. They did so in a way that created what some observers have called the perfect dictatorship of the or the Institutional Revolutionary Party in Mexico that ruled from Calles through 2000 and then was out of power until the election of Enrique Peña Nieto in 2012. So again, I bring all of that up just to think about the ways in which revolution tears down the house, but we have to also think about what was built in its place. This brings me to talking about Cardenas a little bit. Alan Knight's article that we all struggled with, and I understand and appreciate the struggle because I struggled with it myself the first couple times I read it. But I assigned it to you because Alan Knight is one of the preeminent scholars of the Mexican Revolution. And he's writing from a historiographic perspective by and large. So that means that he's talking about the way that scholars have thought about and written about Cardenismo in the Cardenas years. By and large, scholars tend to interpret Cardenismo as an all-powerful juggernaut that was all about bringing key social and economic and political reforms to Mexico and really taking that institutionalization of the revolution a step further. What Knight is arguing isn't so much an like anti-Cardenas stance, but instead what he's saying is that Cardenas wasn't as absolutely powerful as he's often made out to be. It is true that he was able to effect land reform to a great extent. He was able to nationalize oil. Again, two things that were key to creating Mexico that was for the benefit of the Mexican people. Um, but he wasn't just able to impose his will as a dictator or even a populist. Even populists like Getulio Vargas and Juan Perón, who we also talked about a little bit, especially through the lens of his wife Evita, they also had to negotiate political systems, act in ways that would allow them to gain the support of the people. And whether or not they were doing that to gain power themselves, they did make clear, important concessions to labor, to the agricultural sector, and to the people in general. So again, what I'm getting at is looking at what Alan Knight was saying. It's important to realize he's not anti-Cardenas. He's not saying that Cardenas himself and his ideas were ineffective and a jalopy, but he's saying that Cardenas wasn't all powerful. He had to work with local officials. He had to work with existing political structures in Mexico that had been set up by Calles in order to effect the changes that he wanted to bring about. So he couldn't just do what he wanted. And I think that's really the key thing to realize there. Last but not least, import substitution industrialization, or ISI. Many of you posed the question of, why didn't Latin American countries do this earlier or for longer? And the answer to that is global markets, basically. So when the United States was otherwise occupied, or when the economy worldwide was in a bad state, so I'm thinking of the Great Depression and then the World War II era, when the United States actually kind of called on some Latin American nations to industrialize to support the war effort, when those things were going on, there was a lot of room for new industries to sell their goods throughout Latin American countries and kind of expand on that, Latin America for the Latin Americans theme that we've been talking about with nationalism. However, when those years were over, after World War II, for example, the United States had a much more vested interest once again, as it had had prior to the Great Depression, in supporting multinational corporations who were industrializing in Latin America and who were also reaping the benefits of the natural resources in Latin American nations. So we'll see this as we move forward with the case of United Fruit in Guatemala and the 1954 coup against Jacobo Arbenz that was supported by the United States CIA. Part of the reason for that was that ISI kind of program wouldn't continue to work unless the markets were regulated in such a way that competition from foreign companies wouldn't stifle that growth at home. So when the competition from the United States or from European corporations or even from other Latin American nations was large enough, ISI just was not as effective as it otherwise had been. Also, as Chastain points out, ISI was really effective for larger economies like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, but not so much for smaller economies where the kind of wherewithal to industrialize wasn't really there in the first place. So hopefully that answers some of the questions you had. Those things were two of the key issues that were brought up in your discussion comments and in your journal posts. If I didn't answer them adequately, please let me know, and we can keep talking about this in other ways. And as always, just let me know what questions you have, and I look forward to moving into the next unit with you all.